entering a realm between the hidden and forgotten, a slipstream caught between realities, a secret museum of the esoteric, the private library of shadows, all taking place in a world forged from mystery and caught between logic and myth. You are entering Para-Reality.
Hello and welcome to the mysterious world of Para-Reality. This is a realm where the blurred lines between what's real and unreal merge together, forming an alternate reality where truth and fiction become indistinguishable. I'm Sandman, and I'm your host. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining me here in the secret bunker for another episode of Para-Reality. In a bit of a departure from my normal content, tonight I'm going to present to you a murder mystery, but not just any murder mystery. This is a serial murder mystery dating back to over 40 years, and it's still unsolved. A series of unexplained deaths in Chicago in 1982 starts a nationwide manhunt. The victims are connected by one frightening detail. It looks like all these people took Tylenol and died the same day. Almost every home and hospital in America has Tylenol in it somewhere, and that was true even back 40 years ago. So the fact that these killings could be just something random was certainly the case. But what if these people weren't killed at random? What if they were targeted? Can the elusive killer finally be identified and brought to justice? Who actually committed the Chicago Tylenol murders? Was it a career con man, or was it a self-described closet chemist? Or perhaps it was one of the most famous domestic terrorists in the history of the United States. Tonight, I will uncover the top theories surrounding an ongoing FBI investigation into the over 40-year-old case, and maybe bring into light some information that you've never heard of before. Can this elusive killer finally be brought to justice? Well, to learn that, you'll have to tune in, and find out. But before we get into the program, wow, there we go. Hit the button and nothing happened. I hate it when that does that. Before we get into the program, it's time for fan mail, and it's always one of my favorite short segments of the podcast. Tonight is not going to actually be fan mail, but it's going to be more of a welcoming to some new members. So I want to welcome 2 new subscribers to the podcast. Maureen Joe, and I'm probably going to just slaughter your name, so please forgive me, Maureen. Maureen Joe Pelletier Begley and Leaf Chief. Thank you both for subscribing and for listening to the podcast. I hope that this new collaboration with Evergreen that I've got going on here will bring many more listeners to my fledgling little podcast and get some more exposure out there, because it's you guys who help the podcast grow. And of course, I can't do it without you. So if you're new, or if you're been a long time listener to the podcast, thank you very much. And please, whatever platform you're listening on, please give me a 3-star or better rating. It helps the podcast grow. I really appreciate it. So once again, welcome to new subscribers to the podcast, Maureen Joe Pelletier Begley and Leaf Chief. Thank you both for being new subscribers. Para-Reality is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For more information or to check out other shows on the network, please visit evergreenpodcast.com.
Broadcast from a secret bunker somewhere outside of Nashville, Tennessee. This is the award-winning podcast, Para-Reality.
September 29th, 1982, at 6:30 a.m. in the Chicago suburb of Schaumburg, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman awakens with a sore throat. She tells her parents she's not feeling well. She has sniffles, she's coughing, and to alleviate her symptoms, she takes some Tylenol. Her father is downstairs, and suddenly he hears a thud in the upstairs area. He runs back upstairs, and Mary is sprawled out on the bathroom floor. They rush Mary to the hospital, and when she finally gets there, she was pronounced dead at 10 a.m. A few hours later, in nearby Arlington Heights, 27-year-old postal worker Adam Janis collapses after complaining of minor chest pain. He's rushed to Northwest Community Hospital, where he arrives in critical condition. Shortly thereafter, he dies of what doctors initially thought was heart failure. In shock, Adam's brother, Stanley, and sister-in-law, Teresa, return home from the hospital, and they are suffering from headaches, and they themselves take a dose of Tylenol each. That same day, they also collapse and die. The police were baffled. They had 3 victims of the same family in the same house. They initially suspected carbon monoxide poisoning, so they called in some technicians, but no carbon monoxide could be detected. So the police called the public health department for medical guidance, and the public health department sent a nurse named Helen Jensen out to the Janis family home. Jensen finds a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol with 6 capsules missing in the home. So there were 3 doses taken from that bottle of Tylenol, and there were 3 people who were dead. So suspecting a connection here, Jensen takes this bottle back to the medical center to get it tested because she really feels that this could be something important. Authorities at Northwest Community Hospital turn this Tylenol over to law enforcement. Now, Jensen suspects the Tylenol from the very beginning, and she actually says this to the investigating officers. The Janis family have no idea what's killed 3 members of their family so far. So, as you can imagine, they're terrified. So they're brought to the hospital and put under observation, and officials even went so far as to give them their last rites because they didn't know what was killing these people, and they had no idea who would be next. While the Janis family remains under watch, 18 miles away in the suburb of Winfield, Mary Reiner arrives home. She's recently given birth, and she wants some pain relief. After taking extra-strength Tylenol, Mary Weiner collapses. She's rushed to the hospital, and she also dies soon thereafter. So now we have 5 fatalities, each an apparent mystery. Authorities are confounded. The Janises and Mary Kellerman all died in Cook County, which meant they all ended up in the same morgue. And there were also 2 bottles of Tylenol. The Tylenol bottle that's used by the Janises and the Tylenol bottle that Mary Kellerman got her Tylenol from. Both bottles had the same lot number, which was MC2880. They also have another weird thing in common. They both had the distinctive smell of bitter almonds in the bottle. Now, trained professionals, especially medical professionals, know that this almond smell can only mean one thing. When you know some stuff about poisons and contaminants, that bitter almond smell can only mean cyanide. So it's a real mystery. Who would do this? Who would put cyanide in these Tylenol bottles? And why? Why did this happen? Why cyanide? Police have tons of questions. So what cyanide does as a poison, and one of the reasons that they use it when they are executing prisoners, is that cyanide blocks the cells in your body from absorbing and transporting oxygen. And it does this rather quickly. It's really fast acting, and it's really dangerous if you are exposed to it. Tests performed on those capsules from the Tylenol bottles confirmed the worst fears of the investigators. Not only were the Janices and Mary Kellerman killed with cyanide, but the dose that was contained in those pills was about 1,000 times more potent than what you'd need to kill a human being with. So there was a lot of cyanide in those pills. Now, authorities are panicked because they don't know how far this is going to go. Is it just in Chicago's suburbs? Is it nationwide? Well, they don't know. So while authorities are struggling to connect the dots, there's another incident. At around 3 a.m., a woman named Mary McFarland was working at her telephone company job, and she began to not really feel all that great. So she took a Tylenol, and almost immediately she passes out and had to be rushed to the hospital, where she too died. After Mary McFarland's collapse, they're looking to see, is this another victim? And sure enough, there are poisoned pills in the Tylenol bottle, just like in the others. And then that morning, Deputy Medical Director Edmund Donahue addresses the public. Donahue hits the airwaves, letting everyone know that if you have Tylenol from this certain lot number, MC2880, whatever you do, do not take anything from that bottle. Now, remember, this is back in 1982, over 40 years ago. There wasn't any social media. There wasn't Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X, or whatever you want to call it. Nothing like that. There was no internet. As a matter of fact, there's only 3 networks on the TV airwaves to get the word out. So police, in addition to this being aired on the 3 whole television networks that existed back then, police were going around with bullhorns, making announcements in the streets to make sure that people would not be taking Tylenol from this lot number at this time. Now, this is a huge deal, right? Because Tylenol is probably the #1 pain medicine in the country at the time, or at least the #1 over-the-counter pain medicine in the country at the time. Every hospital and every home in America probably had Tylenol somewhere within it. So the makers of Tylenol, Johnson & Johnson, they moved quickly to recall 4.7 million capsules from lot number MC2880, which had all been manufactured in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, at this point, they're treating it like a homicide. They're treating this whole thing like these people were killed deliberately, a homicide, right? They just don't have any idea how to figure out who's doing this. The next day, authorities form a coordinated multi-agency task force. Chicago PD is involved, and it ends up being something like 140 law enforcement officials who were involved in this thing, to include the FBI. So not only were they investigating multiple homicides, but they're also trying to figure out, are there any more bottles on the shelves out there, which was key. Before this task force can even mobilize and hit the streets, though, guess what? There's another incident in Old Town Chicago around 5 p.m. that day. A woman named Paula Prince is found dead on the floor of her home, and guess what? There's an open bottle of Tylenol on her bathroom floor. But this bottle is different. This bottle, instead of being manufactured in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, was manufactured in Texas. And the number on that particular bottle, the lot number was 1920MD. Now, we have a different lot number that's been tainted with cyanide. And, of course, not all the red flags go up. Well, all the red flags are going up at this point, right? So now they know that this isn't contained to just a single lot number. It's spread to at least 2 lot numbers, and they don't know how far this thing might go, how many lot numbers might these tainted pills be in? Mayor John Byrne orders all Tylenol removed from the shelves of stores in Chicago. People, of course, were panicked, so they were calling to, the police, saying, "Oh my God, I just took a Tylenol. Am I going to die?" And emergency responders, on the other hand, they'd say something like, "Well, if you're able to call and you're able to talk, you're going to be okay, but please don't take any more Tylenol." So no one knew if it was in every bottle of Tylenol, if it was just in select few bottles of Tylenol, or was it just in the 2 lot numbers that I've already described? No one had any clue whatsoever. So we have a bunch of problems going on here, right? We've got cyanide-laced Tylenol. We don't know who's doing it. We don't know how they're doing it. We don't know how many bottles or lot numbers of these tainted pills were in. So the first problem for police is, where do you start with all of this? Is whoever's doing this, is it just some random lunatic, or is it a serial killer? Well, the obvious first place to look is to see if maybe it's something that happened in the supply chain. So investigators start with the Chicago offices of Johnson & Johnson. So police go there and they interview several current and former Johnson & Johnson employees looking for anyone bearing a grudge against Johnson & Johnson. And even Johnson & Johnson themselves put out a $100,000 reward for any tips that might lead to whoever was doing this. But unfortunately, nothing came of it. They're also concerned about if, there are other pills out there somewhere. And their interviews with employees, as far as the police go, it gets them absolutely nowhere. So they're at a dead end. They're back to step one, right? So now they realize that some drastic steps need to be taken here. So on October 5th, 1982, Johnson & Johnson took a very bold initiative in something that they, I'm sure, did not want to have to do, but they did the right thing. They recalled all Tylenol products nationwide. That was a total of 31 million bottles of Tylenol, valued at the time at over more than $100 million. That, even $100 million today, is a lot of money. But you can imagine back in 1982 how far $100 million would have taken you, how much money that is. And they were pretty successful. They were able to test all of these bottles, I think. And out of all of the bottles that got recalled and turned in to Johnson & Johnson, 50 pills were contaminated. And those 50 pills were only in 8 of the 31 million bottles. So they tested a ton of pills. And only 50 pills contained in 8 bottles were contaminated. 2 of the bottles had been returned in the recall, and 1 other bottle was found after the fact. It was still on the shelf, but it hadn't been sold yet. And they're lucky somebody else didn't buy those 3 bottles, or even the one that was on the shelf. I mean, they got really lucky that didn't happen. So now they know these tainted pills were produced only in the state of Pennsylvania or Texas, thanks to the lot numbers. But one thing they don't find is any evidence of pills that are tainted with cyanide outside the Chicago metro area. And while Johnson & Johnson is testing all of this, they make another huge breakthrough. A chemist at Johnson & Johnson discovered that when you put cyanide into these Tylenol capsules, that it degrades within 24 hours, which means these crimes had to happen at the local level, because the amount of time that it would take for a pill to dissolve the cyanide to put in that you would replace in that pill to dissolve, the amount of time after you put that cyanide in, it doesn't allow for shipping it out from the factory and waiting until it hits the store shelves. So whoever's doing this had to act fast. Now, we're talking about capsules here. So what capsules used to be, and they still do make some capsules this way, but the majority of them are solid now. But back then, in 1982, capsules were basically for lack of a better word, I don't know exactly what the outside of it was made, but so I'm going to say plastic, but it wasn't plastic. It was some dissolvable, something that was supposedly safe for consumption, but it was a hollow plastic tube looking thing that had two sleeves on it. They had an inner sleeve and an outer sleeve, and the medication was usually in a powder form, and it was put inside one of the sleeves, and the sleeves would be slid into each other, one fit inside the other, and then when you took it, your digestive system would slowly dissolve the protective capsule, whatever it was made of, the plastic, for lack of a better word. Your digestive system would slowly dissolve the capsule and then slowly release the powdered substance that was in the capsule. So you could, at the time, easily pull apart a capsule like that, dump the contents out, and put in whatever you wanted it to do. It could be cyanide, it could be cocaine, it could be heroin, it could be talcum powder, it could be rat poison, whatever you wanted it to be. You could put it in there and slide those pills back together, those capsules back together, and put it back in the pill bottle. Now, one of the reasons why I know that you can do this is because I did stupid shit like that when I was a kid, playing with pills and stuff, like, over the counter, like Tylenol. And I didn't like put poison in the capsules or anything like that, but I distinctly remember pulling apart the capsules and dumping the powder out onto, like, I don't know, the kitchen table or a desk or something like that, and making a little pile of Tylenol and getting in trouble from my mother, because my mother caught me. I mean, so you could do stuff like that, and then you have this little hollow capsule that you could put whatever you wanted to in it. And if you wanted to, I don't know, play drug dealer or whatever when you were a kid, you had these little empty things. You could take them and pretend like you were taking drugs or whatever. I don't know. Just, it was the 80s, but people did stupid shit, right? So anyway, we're talking 1982, and at this time, pill bottles didn't even have this tamper-proof seals on them. So anyone could go in the store, take a bottle of Tylenol off the shelf, open up the box, open up the pill bottle, and dump out some contents of a pill or two and fill it with cyanide, and you could do this without detection. If you were smart enough, you could put it back on the shelves. I mean, you could do this virtually anywhere. And once again, 1982, so there weren't surveillance cameras on, every street corner and in every corner of every grocery store, drugstore, whatever. It wasn't like that. So if you were good and you were careful, you could potentially snag a box off of the shelf, go out to your car, have plenty of time and privacy to do whatever you wanted to, put it back together, make it look all nice and neat, and then walk back into the same store where you just got it from and slip it back onto the shelf. It wasn't going to be that hard. So if this wasn't an inside job with Johnson & Johnson, which they couldn't prove that it was, there was no reason to think that it was. So we're thinking at this point, this is not an inside job. So this case becomes much more difficult, right? Because now the police have to canvass the entire Chicago area for any suspect, and it could be anybody. Early October 1982, media coverage of the Chicago Tylenol murders is constant, and it is frenzied because this is a huge story. Mass hysteria has broken out especially in the city of Chicago, but all over the nation, really. It's, as far as the news media coverage is concerned, it's kind of like the Kennedy assassination in the way that it just captivated America's attention. I remember I think maybe in elementary school or junior high or something at the time, and I remember us talking about this in class. That's how big it was. We were actually having, instead of doing our class lessons, we were actually talking about the Tylenol murders, and our teacher, I think it was social studies or something like that, our civics class, it was probably social studies, but I digress, doesn't matter. The teacher in the class at the time was urging us to throw away Tylenol bottles. Don't take any Tylenol, and I remember the teacher had brought in a VHS tape where it was a male teacher, where he had recorded the news, and he made us watch the news segment about this Tylenol thing. And I was in Southeast Alabama, and this was taking place in Chicago, which, really isn't all that far away from my hometown. Just a few states, a few hundred miles. So this was something that very well could have affected us. And it was just something that was, can't speak for what was going on in the rest of America, but I know where I was, it was taken very, very seriously. So there's somewhere in the area at this time of about 100,000 different newspaper articles that were done about this particular case. And it was on the news almost every night in the national news, even in the local news. And the scary thing is that 7 days now have passed since the first murders or the first deaths, and they still don't have any viable suspects. Then on Wednesday, October the 6th, investigators finally received what they hoped would be a clue. There was a ransom letter that arrived at the Johnson & Johnson offices, and this letter claims to be from the person who was poisoning these Tylenol bottles. So finally, police have a suspect. In the letter, the Tylenol killer appears to be bragging about his prowess. He claims that it only takes 10 minutes to contaminate a bottle, and he said that he's only spent about $50 total to kill all of those people. And by the way, hey, Johnson & Johnson, if you don't want the killings to continue, you better give me $1 million. As a matter of fact, wire it to this bank account, but don't tell the FBI. Now, the tone of this letter, as you can imagine, is really creepy. And the writer of the letter says, "It's so easy to get buyers to swallow the bitter pill. It's really the work of a sociopath. However, this isn't a really smart criminal here. If this is a genuine ransom letter, the person who sent it, remember they said, hey, wire $1 million to this bank account. They put their actual bank account number in the letter. And lo and behold, guess what? Pretty easy to trace that down. And the bank account belongs to a man named Frederick Miller McKay. So could the Tylenol killer finally have a name? Well, the investigators follow the trail, and they go to McKay, and they speak to him, and guess what? They find out that he's one of the heirs to the Miller brewing fortune. So clearly, this guy is not likely to be the Tylenol killer. He doesn't need $1 million. He has way more than that already. So they go back, they reanalyze the letter, and this time they do a little bit better job, and they find a fingerprint. And it traces back to a man named Robert Richardson. So on October 13th, 1982, police issue a warrant for the arrest of Robert Richardson, and the warrant is for extortion. Now, remember, they don't know that this guy is killing people. He just wrote a letter that says, hey, I'm doing it, and I want money to stop. So they've got him on extortion, right? But at this point, he's a ghost in the wind. They can't find him, don't know where he is, until a few days later. Then the alleged killer makes contact again, and he sends a second threatening letter, and this time he sends it, dumbass, to the White House. That's right. Sends a threatening letter to the state, the national capital. So the letter matches the handwriting on the first letter, and it also includes a death threat to President Ronald Reagan. And in the letter, the person demands the taxation overhaul, or else the killings will continue. So now we've got oh, hey, I'm doing it. If you want me to stop, give me $1 million. To now he's sending stuff to the president saying, I want you to overhaul the taxes, or else I'm going to continue to kill all these people. What a dumbass. So within days, you got a third letter that arrives, and this time it's to the Chicago Tribune. But unlike the other letters, this one, instead of it saying, hey, I'm doing this and I want money, or I want you to do this for me if you want these killings to stop, this one, it seems like the guy's maybe come to his senses and realized that he has really effed up big time. So now this one is an attempt to clear his name. So he identifies himself not as Robert Richardson, but as a man named James Lewis. And in this letter, he includes a copy of his thumbprint and a copy of his driver's license. So everything's there for the authorities to identify who this guy is. So Lewis's thumbprint is a match, and investigators find out that this Robert Richardson name is only an alias that this guy was using. So his real name is James Lewis. So Lewis said that he was just being opportunistic, and that he had nothing to do with the murders, and he was just trying to make a buck. He thought, maybe I can get someone to send me some money and take advantage of this. So it was really a crime of opportunity and not a mass murder, or at least as far as Lewis was concerned. So James Lewis is now at the very top of the FBI's most wanted list. And they have a photo of this guy, so they take his photo and they circulate it nationwide. So they have this massive manhunt looking for this Lewis guy. And on December 13th, 1982, they find him and they arrest him. So now he's in custody. And the next day, on December 14th, his wife, Leanne Lewis, she turns herself into the Chicago police. So the police at this point were probably relieved, and they had a really strong suspect in their custody, and it didn't seem that any more people were dying in the same way. So Lewis admitted to sending around these letters, but he denied any involvement in the murders. He said that he was simply trying to frame McKay because he thought McKay was crooked, and he was trying to get the FBI to take a look at him, and hopefully they would look into his financial activities and find something that was wrong or illegal or whatever and arrest this guy. So it's not making much sense, but hang on, okay? We're going to clear that up. So now Lewis has been interviewed multiple times, and he basically sticks to the story that he didn't have anything to do with these murders. So we find out in all these interviews that Lewis's wife, who's also in custody, remember she turned herself in, she worked for McKay. And there was a falling out between the two of them because apparently the wife's last check, which was around $511, had bounced. So Lewis was pissed off. So for $511, this Lewis guy goes after McCahey and basically tries to implicate him in the Tylenol murders. So is Lewis simply inventing an elaborate defense here, or could his story actually be true? So to defend himself, this Richardson / Lewis character says, hey, this would be really easy to do. Let me show you how. So he takes the police and he talks them through opening up capsules, replacing the powder inside with cyanide, and closing it back up. And apparently his thought was to show the cops that it's so simple that anybody can do it. But I guess once a dumbass, always a dumbass. And as you can probably figure out, this wasn't the smartest move, because now the police are really feeling comfortable that this was their guy, because he was like, look, this is how you do it. I didn't do it, but this is how it's done. And what's crazy about this whole thing is that you start looking at Lewis's background, and at one point in time, he actually had some involvement in the pharmaceutical industry. He also had a short-lived business venture where he was importing, guess what? Pill-making machines from India. Lewis's criminal record also gets investigators' attention, and because in the past, he had committed stupid stuff. Like when he was a teenager, he committed a few assaults. One time, he took an axe and chased his stepfather around, saying he was going to kill him. At one point in time, he even tried to commit suicide. And later, he said that the reason he did all these things was because the Vietnam War was going on, and he didn't want to get drafted, so he was trying to prove that he was crazy. But, a lot of people question even that. And he also served 2 years in prison for tax fraud. So it's looking like at this point, the investigators have all they need to prosecute Lewis for extortion, including this confession thing that they have from him stating that, yeah, I sent the letters, but, I was just being opportunistic. So now they need to prove that he's actually a murderer. So law enforcement starts to build a timeline of this guy's whereabouts in the months before the poisonings. And they find out that Lewis was running from law enforcement in Kansas City back in December of 1981. So he's been on the run from Kansas City cops for a year. And when he left Kansas City, that's when he started using the alias of Robert Richardson, and his wife also used the same Richardson alias last name. So James Lewis's main alibi for not committing the Tylenol murders is that he wasn't anywhere near Chicago when all this happened. In early September of 1982, he and his wife booked cash tickets on Amtrak, left Chicago for New York City using the aliases William and Karen Wagner. So they lived there in Manhattan for a few weeks at the time that these Tylenol killings were happening. So investigators confirmed that the couple did, in fact, rent a New York hotel room, but they're still remaining suspicious here. So they've got to figure out, okay, is he in New York on September the 4th, or could he possibly come back to Chicago, take the pills, then went back to New York? The problem is that no one can prove this hypothesis because we didn't have the technology back then that we have now. Like I said earlier, there weren't cameras on every street light and every corner and in every building, office building, drugstore, bank, pharmacy, whatever. But hold your horses. There is one camera that might hold an answer. So if you rewind to 2.5 months, or if you fast forward, to 2.5 months after the Chicago Tylenol murders, police have their suspect, James William Lewis, who's in custody. Now, I think 2.5 months on this was, especially for 1982, considering what they had to work with as technology and everything, I think that was pretty damn good. So they have James William Lewis in custody, but can they prove he's the killer? They definitely have him on extortion, right? I mean, he's confessed to it. It's a pretty open and shut case. But he's adamant that he didn't have anything to do with the poisonings, and the police can't place him in Chicago. So his alibi is really strong until some new evidence surfaces. A woman by the name of Paula Prince bought a bottle of Tylenol. And there actually was surveillance video of this. She bought it in a Walgreens pharmacy, and there was a surveillance video of this. And this is a key part of the investigation because the police are able to go back and find that she purchased her Tylenol on September the 28th, 1982. And what's interesting here is they actually have this security camera video, and it's at the register where she's paying for her Tylenol. So this is huge. And guess what? There's a man a couple of feet behind her who looks an awful lot like James Lewis. So if he's there during the time that Paula Prince bought her Tylenol, then that's it, right? You think you have enough to close the case. But unfortunately, the video isn't clear enough for a positive ID. So Lewis here presents himself as an opportunist and a hustler and a con man, but he says, hey, I'm no killer. I was just trying to make some money. You know, killing's not in his repertoire. Or so he says. But when police dig a little bit more deeper, they discover Lewis isn't quite as innocent as he claims. As police unfold his background, they find that he actually had been charged with murder in the past. In the mid-1970s, Lewis was running a little tax and bookkeeping firm with his wife in Kansas City. Remember, he's been on the run from Kansas City law enforcement for a year when he was caught in Chicago by the Chicago cops. So he was living in Kansas City, running this tax and bookkeeping firm with his wife. And one of their favorite clients was this elderly guy named Raymond West. So what's interesting here, here's where it gets really good. On July the 21st of 1978, Raymond West completely disappears. He has a friend named Charles Baker, and Charles goes over to Raymond West's house to check on him, see how he's doing. He hasn't heard from him in a while. And there's a letter on the door that says, hey, Ray is out of town. For further, call Jim. And guess what? It's written on Lewis and Lewis stationery. So that's pretty weird, according to his friend. So Ray, or West, whatever you want to call him, according to his friend Charles Baker, Raymond West doesn't go out of town very often. And when he does, he tells Charles about it. So Charles Baker calls the cops. He's like, this is suspicious. I need you to check this out. So the police actually enter the house and they look around, but they don't see anything strange. So they leave. Everything looks like it's in order. So you fast forward 3 weeks, and Charles Baker goes back to Raymond West's house again, this time on August the 14th. He lets himself in, and when he opened the door, he's met with a horrible stench. He didn't even go in any further. He just turned around and went and got the cops and brought them back. And, of course, they're experienced enough that they knew from the smell what they were dealing with here, that it was a decomposing body. So the police start a more thorough search of the house, and they go into the basement, and they find a bloody lawn chair, some rope, and a garbage bag that has Raymond West's toupee and eyeglasses in it, as well as some blood-stained sheets. So this is looking really bad for West. And the smell, this evidence that they find in the basement, that he's probably dead, right? That's probably him that's stinking. So they go upstairs, and as they go upstairs, police officers notice that there is a weird, nasty-looking stain running from the ceiling down the wall. So they continue to follow the source of this stain and stench, and it leads them to the attic where they find a body with its legs chopped off. So there's a white rope around the remains. There's bags covering parts of the body. And as you can imagine, it's been 3 weeks. This is in the summertime. The decomposition is tremendous. The smell is awful. And they knew that they had the work of a killer here, but they just didn't know why or who. You just don't kill yourself like this, right? This was not a suicide. Very obvious. Although today's day and age, the coroner might rule it a suicide depending on what's going on, right? But I digress. So the cops continue to search the house and gather more evidence, and they find a $5,000 check made out to, guess who? James Lewis. So the police beat feet over to find James Lewis, and they ask him, hey, can we search your car? And Lewis is like, yeah, sure. You can search my car. I got nothing to hide. So the cops open up the trunk of the car, and guess what? They find 20 feet of white rope, trash bags, just like the ones that's found in Raymond West's house, the ones that part of his body is covered up with. They find a briefcase with Raymond West's papers in it and a stack of checkbooks from the account of Raymond West. So, wow, imagine all that. And so in late August 1978, the Jackson County grand jury charges James Lewis with capital murder because he's obviously arrested there on the spot, gets brought before the grand jury, and they're like, yep, we are going to indict you for capital murder. But before the case can even get started, before any evidence can even be presented, Lewis's attorney gets the entire thing thrown out on a technicality. It seems that once the police arrested him, they forgot one of the most important things to do when you arrest somebody, which is read the Miranda rights. So the arresting officers failed to inform Lewis of his rights, and every bit of the evidence that the cops had found would be thrown out of court, considered inadmissible because he hadn't been read his rights. So without all of this evidence, there essentially was no case. So James Lewis walked out the door scot-free, never even went to trial. So despite the lack of conviction, police investigators who are working the current Tylenol case now believe that Lewis is capable of murder. But do they have enough evidence to prove it? So this guy gets away with murder in 1979, and in 1982, the police have him for at the very least, extortion. But the authorities can't connect him to the Tylenol case because all they have is just all this circumstantial evidence. His alibi said he was in New York. And the evidence that they have is circumstantial, so he's like, I was in New York. You don't, and the cops are like, yeah, we really don't have anything. Can you believe that? So in October of 1983, fast forward to 1 year after the Tylenol killings, Lewis finally gets tried for extortion, and this time he's convicted. He serves 13 years of a 20-year sentence. So after that, police have another chance to maybe find some closure in the Tylenol case, so they look for more evidence again. They searched his house in 2009. They confiscated some computers and paperwork that they hoped would point to him as having been the mastermind of this poisoning scheme. In 2010, they got a court order to get DNA from James Lewis and his wife, Leanne, who apparently, I guess, was still married to him. But charges never came. So was it really Lewis in the Walgreens video behind Paula Prince? And is Lewis the individual that put the cyanide in these Tylenol pills, or is he not? When the Tylenol murders rocked Chicago in 1982, investigators initially believed that it was just an isolated event. But as they dig deeper, they unravel an unsettling possibility that the killer had been active before. In fact, he could be one of the most infamous criminals in United States history. 1 week into the initial investigation, a Chicago detective is dispatched to Sheridan, Wyoming to follow a lead. On October 8, 1982, New York Times released an article that talked about a lead up in Wyoming. Now, there was a very similar homicide that occurred using tainted extra-strength Tylenol that had been laced with cyanide. So they sent a team of investigators up there to go ahead and look at this particular case. And as it turns out, a couple of months before the Chicago murders happened, on July 26th in Sheridan, Wyoming, a 19-year-old janitor named J. Adam Mitchell is found dead of cyanide poisoning, just like the cases in Chicago. And according to his mother, the only thing that he had taken prior to his death was extra-strength Tylenol. Chicago PD and the FBI couldn't make a direct connection other than just circumstantial evidence between Sheridan, Wyoming poisoning of Mitchell and the Tylenol murders 2 months later in Chicago. So the case kind of goes cold for about 30 years. Then a very high-profile suspect is thrust into the spotlight. On May 19th, 2011, dozens of news agencies pick up on the story about a new Tylenol murder suspect. The FBI was seeking DNA from none other than Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Kaczynski was a reclusive mathematician convicted of sending bombs through the mail for nearly 20 years, killing 3 people and wounding 23. He's currently serving 8 life sentences for his crimes in a prison medical facility in North Carolina. In 1978 through 1980, Kaczynski was living with his parents in Lombard, Illinois, which is right outside of Chicago. Now, obviously, the first 4 attacks occurred right there in the Chicago metropolitan area. Kaczynski also intermittently stayed with his parents after that time frame. Lombard, Illinois, could also be an ideal home base for the Tylenol killer. All the stores where the Tylenol was purchased were within a 20-mile drive from Kaczynski's parents' house. So he would have known these stores. He would have known easily how to get to them. He would have been comfortable in the area, and that's something else to think about. Poisoning within a particular radius. So when you look at this video that of Paula Prince, and you see that this individual is standing behind Paula in Walgreens, not only does he kind of look like Lewis, the main suspect at the time, but he also kind of looks like Ted Kaczynski too. But remember, this video was 1982, so this video is really grainy. It wasn't very clear. So, it could have literally been anybody, but if you're able to see it, it does look a lot like Ted Kaczynski to me. The overlap between what Kaczynski is convicted of and the Tylenol murders, well, it had people starting to wonder. After all, they're both domestic terrorism cases, and actually some of Kaczynski's first terrorist attacks originated in Chicago. So it makes sense. It makes really good sense. And there's also another reason the authorities think Kaczynski could be responsible, because when you look at where he was arrested in Montana and you follow Interstate 90 to go to Chicago, almost in that direct line is Sheridan, Wyoming. It's just a little off I-90. So here we have another circumstantial connection for Kaczynski being involved in at least the Sheridan, Wyoming murder and the 1982 Tylenol murders in Chicago. So could Ted Kaczynski have committed this Sheridan, Wyoming crime as like a run-up or a practice to his much bigger crimes later? Well, Ted Kaczynski was a really good planner. He tested his stuff out before he actually committed his crimes. So it could be that the Sheridan, Wyoming homicide was the precursor to what happened in Chicago 2 months later in 1982. That's the way Ted Kaczynski operated. Now, Kaczynski denies any involvement with the Tylenol case, and he claims he never had cyanide in his possession, and the cops didn't find any in his cabinet in Montana. So since 2011, police haven't filed any charges against Ted Kaczynski for these Tylenol murders. So it's possible that there just wasn't a DNA match or there wasn't enough evidence to connect him, but it's also possible that they're still building a case against him. So, no news doesn't necessarily mean anything in this day and age. So 1 month into the hunt for Chicago's Tylenol killer, investigators have a new and provocative question. What if all these people weren't killed at random? Investigators look into the victims' friends and family, searching for any potential motive. Does anyone have a husband or a wife who has a reason to commit murder? Does an employee who is disgruntled with their job have a reason to do this? Most of the victims seemingly have no enemies. However, one victim, Mary Rayner, might have a connection to a possible suspect, the famous Roger Arnold, and he's a self-proclaimed closet chemist. Around the time of the murders, he's heard openly bragging about having access to cyanide. Now, this guy is a barfly, so he hangs out at one particular tavern, and he's constantly talking to the bartender, to the regulars, to anybody, basically about how easy it is to poison people, and basically goes into detail as to how it could be done. Now, one of these people listening at the bar thought this guy's theories were a little too close to plausible and called in a tip to the cops asking for investigators to take a look at Roger Arnold. So things that raise eyebrows about Arnold were, well, he worked in a warehouse for Jewel grocery stores, and that was a place where one of the bottles of Tylenol was found. And at the warehouse where he worked, he was a colleague with the father of one of the victims. So we have a little bit of a tangential relationship here. This is the first time police have identified a suspect who might have a connection to one of the victims, Mary Rayner. So did he have some sort of beef with the Rayner family? Was this a revenge killing? It could be. One thing police will tell you at the time is that there's no such thing as coincidences. Now, hell, they'll probably even say that now. Officers act on the tip immediately and bring Arnold in for questioning. And at the time, Arnold was out on an assault complaint that he'd already been arrested for, so the police had a good reason to check in on him. So they bring him in, and they're talking to him about what he thought about the Tylenol murders, and he was point blank asked, do you have anything to do with this? And of course he said, absolutely not. Now, strangely enough, don't know why he did this, but he did tell the cops that he had at one point cyanide, but he got rid of it in August, and the crimes weren't committed until late September. So according to him, it was all gone by then. Now, this is all circumstantial, but it's very alarming because we have a suspect who fancies himself as a quote-unquote closet chemist, and he has a connection to one of the victims, Mary Rayner, and he worked in the perfect spot to pull off a crime like this. Not to mention he admitted to having cyanide. Well, as you can guess, that's enough to get a search warrant for Arnold's apartment. And inside, what did the police find? Well, they found chemicals, weapons, how-to guides for committing various criminal activities, and they also find 2 one-way tickets to Thailand. They also found 5 unregistered guns, chemistry equipment, and white powder. The white powder turns out to be potassium carbonate, which isn't the same as potassium cyanide. But if you modify it a little bit, it can be deadly. You can make a synthetic version using other ingredients. And Arnold doesn't help himself either with all this, because he won't tell the police why he has this potassium carbonate in his possession. He just says that it's not illegal to possess it, so don't worry about it. And investigators next ask Arnold to take a polygraph test, which obviously he refuses, so he ends up charged with the assault and weapons violations. Now, while he's awaiting trial on these charges, he's released on $6,000 bail, and this man is very angry at this point in time. So when he was being interviewed by law enforcement officers, he made a very interesting statement. He said, and I quote, "I'd like to be in on the homicide of the guy that turned me in." Now, that's a very, very bold statement and strange statement to make, don't you think? So then on the morning of June 18th, 1983, Arnold completely snaps. He loses it. He's become convinced that the bar owner, a man named Marty Sinclair, is the guy who turned him into the police. So he starts to stalk this guy. And he approaches him. He pulls out a gun, says something like, "You turned me in," and he shoots him right there, point blank. The man drops dead, but guess what? It's not Marty Sinclair. The guy that he killed was somebody completely different. He was a computer consultant named John Stanislaw. Now, he was a father of 3 kids, and he had a wife, and he had absolutely no connection to the case whatsoever. So Arnold is arrested for this. He's convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison for killing Stanislaw. Now, he only ends up serving half of that, 15 years. And he dies in 2008 without admitting any guilt or any involvement whatsoever in the Tylenol case. So the case files remain closed to public or press inspection. It's still an open investigation, so we'll never know how many prime suspects may have been looked at in the Tylenol murders. Lewis remains a person of interest for many people involved in the case, and Roger Arnold, even though he's dead, he still raises eyebrows. But who else is out there? Kaczynski? And who else was looked at, and who else wasn't looked at? In the years since the Chicago Tylenol murders, many people have wondered if the suspect is still out there at all. Why did the killings stop? Since no other tainted pills show up in Chicago, that led some people to assume that maybe the killer had died, or maybe he just gave up or something like that. But there's another really frightening possibility. In the aftermath of the Tylenol murders, there are hundreds of quote-unquote copycat attempts all across the country. At least that's what the police want us to think. That's what they're categorizing them as. But what if they weren't copycats? Maybe the killer didn't stop after all. So if you fast forward to 1986, there are 4 more deaths that occur due to tampered pain pills. 2 of the victims are attributed to a woman in Seattle named Stella Nickel. She used cyanide-laced Excedrin to kill her husband and a woman named Sue Snow. But there are 2 more deaths that are a little bit more intriguing. In Austin, Texas, in May of 1986, a college student named Kenneth Ferries dies after taking cyanide-laced Anacin. And his death was ruled as suicide because supposedly he had access to cyanide at his job. And so the thinking was that he had tainted or poisoned an Anacin pill himself and intentionally taken it. Now, that seems like a very horrific way to die by suicide, but that's what it was ruled was a suicide. Now, if those of you who don't know what Anacin is, it is I don't even think that it is manufactured anymore. It is a very old, over-the-counter pain reliever. Well, yeah, I'm looking it up right now, and they still do make Anacin. I haven't seen Anacin in years. So Anacin is basically aspirin with caffeine in it. It's an NSAID, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication. It's an analgesic, which means it's a pain pill. It's over the counter. I didn't even know they still made Anacin. That's amazing. So anyway, the official police ruling was that this guy put cyanide in an Anacin capsule and killed himself. I don't know. Why would you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to just, if you wanted to kill yourself and you had access to cyanide and you wanted to kill yourself with cyanide, why not just take straight cyanide? Why put it in an Anacin pill? I don't get it. But anyway, so the other case that probably stood out for people the most occurred in Yonkers on February the 8th, 1986. A woman by the name of Diane Ellsroth took some extra-strength Tylenol that had been laced with cyanide, and she dropped dead, of course. So the tainted bottles were found in stores in Westchester County, and fortunately, they were able to get them all off the shelves before anyone else was killed. So investigators looked at the New York cases to see if maybe this was a continuation of the Chicago cases. Maybe whoever had done it had just been dormant for things to, and laying low, waiting for things to quiet down. There hadn't been a direct connection made between that case and the Chicago Tylenol murders, but it's a theory that's very similar. If the New York cases were connected to the Chicago cases, that would have thrown a wrench in all of the theories up to date, because Roger Arnold and James Lewis were in prison at the time. And the FBI currently believes that maybe it was just a copycat, and that unfortunately there are still 2 poisoning suspects out there at large, or 1 suspect who poisoned 2 people roaming around free out there just waiting to do it again. So in conclusion here, thankfully, these days it's very unlikely that we'll have another epidemic of poisoned pills, at least over the counter anyway. In the wake of the Tylenol murders, the United States government passed the Federal Anti-Tampering Act in 1983. Now, this case and the bill that inspired it are responsible for the tamper-proof seals and packaging that you see on all medicine boxes today. It absolutely changed history and saved countless lives. These poisonings were an act of domestic terrorism, and whoever committed them was a heinous, heartless, and a horrible person. He didn't care who he killed, who went down, how they would die. He just wanted to inflict some damage. It's a terrible case. Now, I remember being able to go to the store, the pharmacy, the grocery store, wherever, and buy your over-the-counter pain reliever pills, Tylenol, aspirin, you name it, and you went home and you just opened up the bottle and you shook it out in your hand and you popped them, right? Well, when they came out with this Federal Anti-Tampering Act, then everything had these seals on them, and now there's a seal on the outside that you have to freaking break loose, and it takes an act of Congress to get it loose, and you open up the bottle, and now there's a seal on the inside of the bottle, and you got to tear that son of a bitch off, and it's always getting all kind of messed up, and it doesn't come off in one piece, and it's like on there with some sort of cement or some shit. It's really crazy, and people were just pissed. People were pissed that they couldn't just go home and just pop open the lid to that thing and shake out a couple of pills in their hand. Pissed that it took, an extra 5 minutes, if that, to get into your pills. And I remember thinking, man, this is stupid. But now, this has been since 1983, so 40 years plus later, there's 2 generations at least of people who don't know a time when you didn't have tamper-proof stuff on all of your pill bottles. It's interesting to look back on it and see, how lackadaisical they were with security with stuff like that. But, different times back then, people just didn't go around doing stuff like that. You trusted that people weren't psycho. And now, you have to assume that everyone is psycho. So you have to protect, everything against the psycho people. It is really, psycho that we have to do that. The families that were affected by the Tylenol murders, they're still awaiting justice. No one's ever been charged. No one's been taken to trial, so no one's been convicted. There are no answers in these murders. This is one of those great cold cases from back in the 20th century that has a lot of questions tied to it. But I think that having the FBI involved, that might be able to produce some new DNA evidence. Hopefully, that can bring us to a conclusion at some point. Now, authorities have gathered thousands of documents, and they've interviewed more than 400 people of interest during their ongoing investigation. And they're currently testing the original cyanide-laced capsules in an attempt to complete some kind of DNA profile on the killer, or maybe they're hoping to get some sort of DNA profile on the killer. And perhaps modern technology can finally close this over 40-year-old case. Whew, man, that is some scary stuff. And I'm so glad that we do have tamper-proof packaging these days. It's just, you never know. You never know. Well, that about does it for tonight. Thank you guys for listening. Before I close it out, though, if you'd like to leave a comment about tonight's episode of Parareality, have an idea for a topic you'd like me to cover, or a story you'd like to tell, send me an email, sandman@parareality.com, or call the Secret Bunker at 615-692-1170 and leave me a message. Don't forget that by leaving me your message, you're giving me permission to play your comment back on the podcast. Also, don't forget to follow Parareality on social media. You can find the podcast on Facebook by looking for sandman.parareality, or you can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram under the username @ParaRealRadio. You can also find Parareality on YouTube under the username Parareality1. That's Parareality with the number 1 out behind it. Parareality.com is the home of the podcast on the web, and it's also where you can find paranormal news from all around the world in the Paranews section. And you can listen to past episodes in the archives section, all for the price of absolutely nothing. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can buy yourself some swag in the official Parareality shop while you're there. You can also support the podcast for free by leaving me a 3-star or better review on whatever podcast app you're listening on. Your reviews help the podcast to grow and reach even more people, and I would appreciate it very much. I'd love to hear from you guys, so send me those emails. Thank you. Well, I hope that you enjoyed tonight's episode of Parareality. Now, there are 5 Fridays this month, so that means that I'll be taking a couple of weeks off before the next episode drops, and that won't be until Friday, April 5th, sometime around 8 o'clock p.m. Central U.S. time, if I can stick to my schedule. Been having some scheduling problems here lately, but that's not nothing I can't overcome, right? So make sure you guys tune in, and find out. Friday, April 5th at 8 o'clock p.m. Central U.S. time. I hope that this podcast opens up your mind to new ways of thinking, expands your consciousness, and produces a change in the way you see the world. If you wish to change, you must lift the veil of ignorance that has been cast over your eyes. Only then will you see the true power of the universe. I hope you have a wonderful evening, a great weekend. I'll see you again on April 5th. Good night, everybody.
If you wish to change, you must first lift the veil of ignorance that has been cast over your eyes. Only then will you see the true First